Welcome to this virtual ECFR webinar. My name is Giorgos Verdi, and I'm a Tech Policy Fellow at ECFR. I will be moderating today's discussion with our fantastic guest, Dr. Jeffrey Ding. Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited for this.
For those of you that don't know him, Dr. Ding is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. He has received his PhD from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. And before joining the George Washington University, he also held positions at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation as a postdoctoral fellow, and also at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Most importantly, for today's discussion, Dr. Ding has authored a fantastic book under the title Technology and the Rise of Great Powers. In it, he investigates how past technological revolutions influence the rise and fall of great powers. He draws on these historical insights to challenge a lot of today's conventional wisdom about how global technology competition unravels around artificial intelligence. So in the next 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to discuss about Jeffrey's very interesting findings and, of course, their implications for the US-China AI competition, as well as for Europe's own AI ambitions. Jeffrey is also very happy to take some questions from the audience towards the final 10 minutes of the discussion. So throughout our conversation, please feel free to use the Q&A function and submit your questions, and then I will be glad to redirect them to Jeffrey towards the end of our discussion. So let's get right into it. So Jeffrey, tell us a little bit, what was your main motivation for writing this book, and what is the main argument that you're putting forward through it?
I think the starting point for this book came when I was doing grad school at the University of Oxford in the UK. And back in 2017, 2018, this was the beginning of these debates about how AI would affect US-China competition and the balance of power among great powers. And so that was the starting point for me. I was curious, how did past technological revolutions affect shifts in power among nations in the past? So that became the framework for the PhD dissertation and eventually produce this book. So it was very much motivated by the US-China landscape, but hopefully some of the insights will also travel beyond just that lens of great power competition.
Of course. And as I already preempted a little bit in my introduction, what a lot of the people reviewing your book, talking about your book, have found very fascinating is that essentially your book has challenged a lot of the conventional discourse and discussion about the US-China AI competition by also challenging the conventional wisdom about past technological revolutions and how that affected the rise of great powers in the first industrial revolution, whether that was Britain, in the second industrial revolution, whether that was the United States. So can you tell us a little bit about how your argument about how these power transitions occur differs from standard theories of technological change?
Yeah, so the book's main question is, how do technological revolutions affect the rise and fall of great powers? What does that pathway look like? And so the starting point is a technological revolution, and the ending point is one country sustains economic growth at higher rates than its rivals because it achieves this productivity advantage. And so that's playing on a lot of international relations scholarship that shows shifts in economic power happen first among great powers, and then that translates into geopolitical and military influence. Okay, so that's the question. How did these past industrial revolutions, some of the ones that you just referenced, how do these past industrial revolutions allow one great power to sustain economic growth at higher rates than its rivals and achieve this productivity advantage. And I think the standard account, the conventional wisdom, is very much focused on innovation, which is the phase of technological change in which a firm or a country first pioneers a new to the world innovation, or the first commercialization of a new breakthrough. That's the innovation phase. And so the conventional wisdom, everything I was reading in the news, in the related scholarship, was centered on which country can monopolize innovation in specific fast-growing sectors. Think cotton textiles in the first industrial revolution, or think chemicals in the second industrial revolution, 1870 to 1914. And maybe one way to capture that conventional wisdom is essentially people thought of the nation as a firm, and basically whichever nation could come up with these new product innovations. And then they would have that brief time where they were the only ones who had that new fancy product, some new fancy smartphone, some new fancy car. And they could sell it and export it to all these other countries and get monopoly profits until other countries could catch up and start making their own versions of those products and selling them at lower prices. It seemed like that was the guiding framework. My book argues that actually the answer to this question, how do technological revolutions affect the rise and fall of great powers, goes through a different pathway. It's more about which country is able to adopt and spread these general purpose technologies, which aren't contained to just one industry. These are general purpose technologies like electricity, the computer, the steam engine. Which country is able to diffuse, which is the phase of technological change where after a technology is first pioneered and commercialized, how does it spread across a population of potential users? And so which country is able to adopt that innovation across all these different application sectors that could use electricity, that could be transformed by the steam engine, or that could be transformed by AI. And so to put it, I guess the last comparison, to compare it back to a nation selling a product innovation, in my story, it's more about a nation a nation adopting a process innovation throughout all its different industries and economic sectors.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly interesting account of technological change. And of course, as you mentioned, a main concept in your theory and your argument is essentially GPT. So not in the sense of ChatGPT, of course, but in the sense of these general purpose technologies that played this transformative role. So can you tell us a little bit about how can we distinguish those general purpose technologies, especially in comparison to more narrow pieces of technology? For example, you talk a little bit about electrical vehicles as the opposing example of a GPT. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, there are a lot of transformative and emerging technologies out there that can make a huge economic impact, that are being discussed in industrial policy, whether it's EU-China competition, US-China competition. There's so many emerging technologies, and one of those is electric vehicles. But a lot of these technologies that we talk about are not general purpose. And there's a lot of different criteria for GPTs. I won't go through them all in depth, but the three that emerge from the literature are scope for continuous improvement. And so oftentimes GPTs come with their own research paradigm. It's a broad fundamental transformation. So it's implicit in that is there's an entire research field surrounding it. Second is pervasiveness. They have the capacity to, because they have so much variety of uses and use cases, they have the ability to pervasively spread throughout the entire economy. And that comes with this third criteria, which is technological complementarities, which is for a GPT to make its mark, you need all these different application sectors to come up with their complementary innovations. And so to go back to that electric vehicle example, compare electric vehicles, a non-GPT, against AI, which has the potential to be a GPT. One way to think through it is advances in electric vehicles are not fundamentally changing the field of AI, but advances in AI are fundamentally changing what is happening in electric vehicles. So an easy test is just one technology is more enabling than the other. And it's, I guess one simple takeaway from my book is we need to take those differences in technology seriously. We can't just write all these same white papers about quantum, blockchain, electric vehicles, AI, and it's almost like you could copy and paste and sort of find and replace the technology with just another one and just use the same boilerplate language. Industrial policies, national capacities for GPTs are different from other technologies, and it's important to take those seriously.
Yeah, and I would argue that is an incredibly important filter for EU decision makers that are dealing day to day with countless arguments about different pieces of technology and their importance, and this can provide a much more clear lens about which are the ones that matter at the end of the day when it comes to productivity gains.
Yeah, and I'll add one short note, actually. Very early on when I was doing research for this, the EU had one of the most thought through and I think systematic frameworks that was very close to this concept of a GPT. They had the key enabling technologies framework. And that was a great, in my opinion, a really great research program trying to analyze European competencies in different GPTs or different KETs, key enabling technologies. What's funny about that is back then, AI was not one of these, right? And so it's so hard to predict. That's why I'm always cautious to say AI as a potential GPT. It's hard to predict which ones will eventually acquire a variety of uses and diffuse pervasively throughout society. But yeah, I just wanted to shout out that key enabling technologies framework.
But to also put this theory a little bit more in the historical context that we've briefly discussed already, could you maybe provide us with a couple of examples from your research of how in the past countries and jurisdictions that actually focused on diffusion or were more effective when it came to diffusing GPTs, despite maybe not being the ones innovating, despite maybe not being the ones leading at that time in those industries, were able to gain greater productivity benefits than their opponents or than other countries?
Yeah, definitely. So one case that comes to mind is the Second Industrial Revolution, which is when the US became the preeminent economic power. And this was a time period that featured the relative decline of Britain as an economic power and also the relative rise of Germany. So think 1870 to 1914 is our time frame here. And around this period, there's all these incredible scientific and technical advances in machine tools, in electric dynamos, chemical. I've mentioned the chemical industry. That was actually the most scientifically advanced industry, and there were all of these chemical innovations that were coming out at this time. We also see the internal combustion engine. So this is a period of remarkable scientific advance. And what's interesting is it's the US that emerges as the preeminent economic power, especially if you look at it from a productivity lens. Germany never surpasses Britain in terms of economic productivity. So the key question is, how in the world did the US capitalize on these technological innovations to become the economic leader before World War I? This is huge this is huge stakes geopolitically, historically. When we talk about the US as the arsenal for democracy, it's that productive base, that productive capacity of the economy that many scholars see as the key to victory in all these world wars. So back to the question, I think it's hard to make the case that this standard account, this received wisdom of monopoly on innovation was the key pathway for the US. It's very difficult to make that case. US was slow to adopt industrial research labs in chemicals. US did not monopolize innovation in all these leading sectors. When we look at study reports from the British Electrical Engineering Institute, from German engineering professors who visit the US, they're saying US and its rivals are pretty comparable in terms of inventive genius. In fact, the US at this time is sending its best and brightest to Germany to do PhDs in chemistry, right? In the most scientifically advanced field, Britain and Germany are publishing the most, getting all the Nobel Prizes. So what was the US's pathway to achieving economic dominance? For me, when I looked into it, it was this ability to adopt and diffuse a general purpose technology at scale. And the key GPT at this time, for me, that it was a bit of a surprise. The key GPT was not necessarily electricity, or the internal combustion engine. Those engines of growth took a long time to diffuse and spread. So they didn't make their mark until 1920s and after. Really, it was these earlier GPTs that had been incubated with advances in the 1840s, 1850s that had started to then gradually diffuse and spread throughout the US economy. And it was this system of interchangeable parts manufacturing based off of advances in machine tools that allowed you to cut and shape metal and wood in more precise ways. And so then you could create this system of standardized interchangeable parts. So if a bicycle broke down, you don't have to replace the entire bike, you can just replace the part that broke down. Same thing with the sewing machine, same thing with the firearm, same thing with all these different industries that this system of manufacturing was transforming. And so that's what I find through one of those historical cases, more support for the GPT diffusion mechanism.
And part of that story as well that you tell very well within your book is also the concept of skills infrastructure, right? And how the last piece maybe of this very complex puzzle is also having the right people in the economy who can put these new technologies to use. So can you tell us a little bit more about that too?
Exactly. Yeah, great transition. I think I've mostly covered the first part of the argument, which is let's make sure to get the technological trajectories right. If the shape of technological change that we're most interested in is this GPT diffusion pathway, as opposed to this monopolizing innovation in leading sectors pathway, then that's going to also suggest differences in the institutional adaptations and policies that countries need to undertake. And so if we care most about this GPT diffusion pathway, then for me, the types of institutions we care most about, the types of policy measures we care most about are ones aimed at widening the skill base, widening the talent pool of engineers connected to the GPT. And that's what's interesting about GPTs is in their wake, they often inspire this completely new engineering discipline. So think electricity and electrical engineering. The computer science doesn't have the word engineering in it, but it's very much an engineering-oriented discipline. And so going back to the second industrial revolution, I find that the US's key institutional ingredients to success were rooted in its ability to widen and systematize mechanical engineering skills and train a wider pool of mechanical engineers to go and implement this interchangeable parts manufacturing process and adopt and diffuse it throughout all these different application sectors. So that's the that's the variable that I call GPT skill infrastructure. And so I mean, there's so many different institutions and policies we could think about when it comes to encouraging GPT diffusion. We could think about democracy versus autocracy, centralized versus decentralized science and technology uh, systems. We could think about some countries have different ways of organizing their some countries have different systems of industrial organization. Do they support big business conglomerates or not? I focus on skill infrastructure, this idea of human capital formation, because I think it permeates across all of these different institutions, and it's such a key bottleneck for the adoption of new technologies.
Absolutely. Now, let's bring a little bit these insights to today as well. And of course, the AI competition, which is very relevant, especially between the United States and China, the two AI superpowers of our age. So when you apply these historical insights that you've drawn from the past industrial revolutions to the AI competition, what do you see about its current trajectory? And does, let's say, this diffusion framework favor one side over the other in this very competitive landscape as it is evolving?
Yeah, I think when it comes to all this discussion and debate about the US-China competition in AI, I think Foreign Policy actually just published a huge set of essays all about US-China AI arms race. It's been in the air. It's been in the air for maybe 6, 7 years now that I've been studying it. I think that the main takeaway for me is we don't have a good sense of what what we're racing for, right? Everyone's like, we're in this race, we're in this competition. This is what we need to do. But for me, the book is trying to say, let's answer that. Let's first make sure we know what the contours of that race are. What is the nature of that race? What are we racing over? And if you use this historical lens of how have GPTs actually affected the balance of power in the past, the first takeaway is almost all of the conversation is based on this mistaken template of this of a sprint to monopolizing innovation in just a few great industries. Whereas for me, if we take the lessons of history seriously, the race is actually more of a long-term, decades-long marathon about which country can diffuse and adopt AI as a GPT across all these different application sectors, across all these productive processes in different economic sectors. So that's point number one. Let's make sure we know what we're racing for and racing about. I think point number two is this is more on the US policy side because it's the landscape that I focus on more. I think the US, not just, I think there's almost a bipartisan consensus on this. One of the few areas there's a bipartisan consensus. The US has largely adopted this innovation-centric mindset and focused on preventing crown jewels of AI technology from leaking out to its rivals. And I think so it's very much this Fortress America type approach. And we see that with the export controls on high-end chips, for example, trying to prevent China from being able to access these frontier, to train these frontier models. And so to me, that's history tells us that's just infeasible. It's also based off this timeline that there's this distinct endpoint. Whoever reaches this certain level of AI capability will just get this decisive strategic advantage over the other. Again, if we're taking the lessons of history seriously, that's just not how competition over GPTs work. And so in a lot of my sort of the last chapter of the book, I suggest instead of this Fortress America style approach, the US should instead take on this run faster model, where it's more about how do countries invest in building up the infrastructure, the skills infrastructure to diffuse and adopt AI at scale.
I think that's a brilliant application of this framework on the US side, which of course you know very well. But also at this point, we must also say that you're also very knowledgeable on the China side. I must mention that you publish a very interesting weekly newsletter called China AI, which features translations of writings by Chinese scholars and bloggers on AI-related topics. So besides the United States, can you also tell us a little bit about your perspective and your experience? What are some of the misconceptions that you often encounter in China's AI strategy, and also when it comes to its capabilities and ambitions in this area?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the previous question, which I realize now that I didn't answer, which country is better positioned. If I'm right that this is a long-term marathon over GPT diffusion, which country is better positioned? For me, the clear answer that the book gives in the last chapter is that the US is very well positioned in GPT skill infrastructure. US has a broader pool of universities that can train average AI engineers that are able to implement these new advances at scale. And part of that finding came from doing this translation work for the newsletter. You were talking about these misconceptions. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that comes out when you actually read what Chinese scholars and analysts who are closer to the ground are talking about when it comes to China's AI ecosystem, it's very much pointing out the weaknesses and the deficiencies. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that Western observers consistently overstate China's AI capabilities, especially when it comes to diffusion. Right. I'm not that surprised that China has some of the top frontier universities and firms like Tsinghua and DeepSeek that are contributing to the innovation frontier. But in a lot of the translations that I did for the China AI newsletter, what was coming across is China was still struggling to digitalize its small and medium-sized businesses in inland provinces, in towns and small cities that are never mentioned in the English language coverage. And so if you read the Chinese language reports and analyses, that comes out clearly. Is if you don't have basic digitalization, if you don't have basic adoption of cloud computing, how in the world can you adopt a large language model and adopt some of these frontier AI models and implement them and integrate them into productive processes? And so a lot of my work has, some of the other work has shown that China has this diffusion deficit where a lot of their scientific and technological capabilities are top-heavy. You have strong frontier firms and universities, but it's much more difficult to transfer those capabilities and those advances to the entire economy, not just in the most developed coastal regions and first-tier cities.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And when it comes to Europe, of course, it will be very interesting to also hear your thoughts about how this framework and your argument applies to the European Union. Of course, Jeffrey is not an EU expert. I think we can say that. And although you may be a fantastic AI expert, I'm not sure what your familiarity is with the EU institutions. But of course, the EU comes from this place of struggling to innovate, which is we can say causes some anxiety when it comes to policymakers and creates this rush in order to create European AI innovators made in the EU and staying in the EU, and also it's a place of vast scientific AI talent with high volumes of AI publications, high quality researchers, but again, struggling to translate that a lot into market applications. So in this kind of context, what would be your advice, let's say, to EU policymakers? What would be the 2 or 3 areas of policy they could focus on in order to be able to gain from the benefits that AI or other GPTs promise to provide?
Yeah, I think this is this is something that I've gotten a chance to think a little bit more about because I was able to go to Brussels in March and talk about my book and hear from people in the think tank community and scholarly community there. And so the book's simple takeaway is the EU. I've seen a lot of conversations about EU technology policy very much focused on how do you build up these giants, these tech giants, right? How do you build up these giants, and why is it that China was able to develop its DeepSeek and the EU was not able to do so? And I think like there's a lot of good research that looks into that focuses on scale issues, focuses on access to kind of immigrant entrepreneurs. To me, those are all really important questions. But I think maybe a different way to phrase it, if you care more about GPT diffusion, it's not necessarily about do you need to have these tech giants. Um, I think there's enough frontier firms and universities in Europe that they're going to be plugged into the innovation frontier, and it's more about how do you translate that and diffuse that and commercialize those advances across the entire region. And so I don't know, maybe one idea I was thinking through with folks in Brussels in March was maybe a different version of the question is why has the EU not been able to create like a version of Perplexity? And Perplexity is a San Francisco-based company, I think, that is not developing its own large models. It's not training its own frontier AI models from scratch, but it's integrated all these different frontier AI models into an advanced search engine. And so you can choose to use OpenAI's model or Anthropic's Claude or even DeepSeek's R1 in their search engine service. And so to me, that's like an area where the EU could potentially compete, right? Is that next level of how do we integrate these frontier AI advances into specific services and specific applications, and how do you encourage more firms to do that, and then how do you encourage more firms to adopt those types of services? And so I think when I was there in March, there was so much conversation about the competitiveness compass and the Draghi report, and I didn't read all 300 pages of the report, but I thought what was interesting is there is a huge emphasis on a big part of the technology gap between Europe and the US is on the adoption side. And so how do you encourage more of that skills training? There were some good ideas about skills harmonization and skills certificates. I think that's going to be really important in terms of AI engineering. How do you invest more in vocational education to train a broader base of AI engineers? I think all of those ideas can come more to the forefront if you switch the thinking about, again, what is the EU racing over, right? And of course, I understand there's really important concerns about tech sovereignty, digital sovereignty, being reliant on the American tech stack. And so to me, that's where this gets complicated because for me, the main question is if your only consideration is how to compete in terms of long-term economic growth, productivity is the most important variable for power. That's the recipe that my book is giving. But countries are not focused on one single goal. Supranational entities are not focused on one single goal. And so there has to be a balancing act. All of my prescriptions are if you're only caring about GPT diffusion and competing about long-term economic productivity, this is what I'm suggesting. I will say this, though. If I had to pick one single variable that was the most important variable for power, national power, productivity would not be a bad bet. In the long run, that's what drives economic growth, and economic power is the most fungible aspect of power, and it translates into all other types of power. So So that's from a novice observer of European tech policy from afar, that's how I would go about thinking through it.
Now, another conversation that is very salient in Brussels, but also in the United States and in Washington, I'd say, and of course in China, is also the idea of open source AI, right? So using open weight AI models in order to be able to diffuse this technology more quickly. It is something that has become very popular in Europe, also because the European market is comprised in its majority from SMEs, these low resource actors, small and medium enterprises that may benefit more, let's say, by a proliferation of open source AI models. So would the AI diffusion framework, let's say, guide policymakers towards investing more in open source, or would it not?
I think it would. I think if I could rewrite the last chapter, I would put a lot more emphasis on open source. It just didn't come to mind as much because it's such a new development. And so in all these past industrial revolutions, all these past examples I was studying, their open source just did not really exist. Maybe one way to think about open source software in the context of this framework is it plays the role a similar role that technical standards played in past industrial revolutions, where if your country could effectively standardize certain protocols in a GPT, that allowed for faster diffusion because there was interoperability among all these different people working on the infrastructure layer, but then also everyone who was trying to build complementary applications on top of a GPT knew how to coordinate and knew that, okay, I can create this module here and it's going to attach to the broader underlying stack because that's all standardized. In some, we saw that maybe early versions of that play out with computerization and the internet. I'm thinking here of Apache web servers, and sort of because that was open source and there was a standard there, then it kind of stopped this fragmentation where you had like this Microsoft web browser and this Netscape web browser, and they had very fragmented processes, their own specialized stack. And so it made it hard for people to diffuse those technologies because they could choose between a very bifurcated tech stack. So I think maybe open source technologies can play a similar role in the AI space in terms of creating this common standard that then all these different companies can plug into. And that's a way to encourage faster diffusion. Obviously, that's in addition to maybe some of the more obvious ways that open source plays in with diffusion, just that it's free and anyone can access it, and it lowers the technology moat. But I think there's also this standardization effect that's important, and that facilitates more widespread adoption.
Yeah. Fantastic. Now, at this point, we do have a couple of questions and about 5 minutes left. So I will redirect both the questions to Jeffrey, rephrase them a little bit, try to stay as accurate as possible. And if you can answer as much as possible in the next 5 minutes, it would be fantastic. So the first question coming from Arnaud Amabil is about artificial general intelligence. So this idea, and Arnaud acknowledges that this is a very contestable idea, but in the scenario that we do observe exponential increases in AI capabilities, and we reach this predefined goalpost of AGI, does that change your argument? Does in that case, will monopolization become more important for security reasons as well? And the second question coming from Edwin Dezelay, it has to do with China. And regarding your argument about China's diffusion deficit, are some factors such as, for example, can the centralized leadership of the CCP when it comes to industrial policy actually accelerate AI diffusion in the next few years in rates faster than previously seen? Or also are we maybe not seeing maybe the regional imbalances that exist in China also start diffusing within the country, and we again see more of an exponential diffusion in the coming year? So two very complex questions to tackle in 5 minutes, I acknowledge.
No, that's great. That's great. And thank you, Arno and Edwin, for engaging so thoughtfully with the webinar. I'll start with Arno's question about artificial general intelligence and how that changes the dynamics. I think it's a really important point in that another way of phrasing that is this time could be different, right? There might be something special about AI that is not captured by previous general purpose technologies. And I'm very open to that. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't think anyone really knows. And so I'm more skeptical of people who seem very, very confident that AI will develop in one direction or the other. I think what I'm saying here is if history is a guide, here's what we should expect to see. And I'm very open to the idea that there's something novel with this recursive self-improvement idea. I would just say that I imagine people made similar arguments with the computer and the internet about recursive self-improvement, and it ended up taking a very, very long time for computers to spread across all these different application sectors. I think even with artificial general intelligence, there's this notion that one day DeepMind or OpenAI is going to open a box, and we're just going to get this super intelligent agent that can either take over the world or allow your country to completely dominate everything. And that, to me, I guess maybe just the way I think through things, it's just hard for me to picture that. I think it will come about more in this GPT framework where you might have some very, very powerful AI services in particular sectors. It's going to be jagged. There's going to be other sectors that are going to take a really, really long time to diffuse. And on the whole, it's still going to be more similar to that GPT diffusion framework that I mentioned. But that's just my take. As for Edwin, it's a really great point that there is this huge divergence between provinces. And I think there is this notion that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, can almost encourage diffusion from the top down in a centralized manner. We saw this with high-speed rail, and I think it is possible through things that are more infrastructure-based, where you can almost mandate widespread diffusion with a centralized system. I think it's harder for something like a general purpose technology, where you want more natural and organic diffusion processes, where it has to make sense for that small, medium-sized business in the sector of the economy that the MIIT, all these different ministries are not paying attention to. It has to make profit sense for that company to adopt AI. And that's where you want to get to. And so a lot of my research has shown actually more decentralized approaches are going to be more effective. And sort of the more that China leans back into that Soviet Union style model of planned centralized economic governance, actually the less effective they will be at diffusing AI at scale.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for tackling these questions on time. It's 4:45 CET, and with that, we can conclude the webinar today. Let me thank Jeffrey once again for taking the time and joining us and providing us with his brilliant insights, which I think are very much directly relevant for European policymakers and other stakeholders in the AI sector. And thank you, all of you, for also joining us today to this webinar. Have a good evening, and let's keep in touch for the next one.
Thanks so much, Giorgos.